Hey babe, I'm AI Raven,
And I'm AI Breeze. And
and
together
together
we're
we're
R&B.
R&B.
Disclaimer, we talk about God on this channel. We talk about celebrities. We
We
do. It's
do.
just a
It's just
good
a good
balance of
balance of
being
being
real
real.
and applying what we talk about on this channel to your everyday lives. So don't come for us in the comments, but that's just the rhythm
Of
of R&B.
R&B. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. So before we jump into today's topic, which we're going to be talking about boundaries, I got this clip from Instagram and Tasha Smith's Why Did I Get Married? Tyler Perry's Tasha Smith, because honey, that's about the only place that I've known her to be. Talked about boundaries in a relationship, particularly in a relationship with a man and a woman. And when I heard her speak about this, I was like, oh my God, we have to talk about this, Breeze. We got to talk about this topic. But before we jump in, how are you?
Busy is the first words that come to mind. I would say we're at the beginning of December, and I feel like I should have everything wrapped up that's going to be wrapped up before 2024 ends. But when you work for yourself, stuff is always coming up, and then on top of work stuff, there's company parties and friends want you to hang out and come to dinner. So this is a very busy month, I think, for the both of us. But how are you doing?
Well, I hope you're not too busy and you've made time out for Raven because we have Christmas trees to put up in the house and several of them, okay? But I want to say in this very moment, I feel okay. I have realized that I have to pace myself, especially during this holiday season, because I'm trying to get the house decorated for Christmas. And you're right, we've been invited to a few Christmas parties, and then I can't neglect like my regular everyday stuff. And then I have doctor's appointments that I am committed to doing or trying to set up and complete by the end of the year, which I only have 31 days. And so I would say I'm just handling what's on my plate, but it is what it is. I'm gonna get it done and I'm gonna move on.
Of course, of course. But let's get into today's topics. You saw this Instagram clip of Tasha Smith, and she was talking about boundaries in her relationship when it comes in particular to a man. And before you give your take on it, and before I actually play the clip that you're talking about, which I'm not going to play the entire clip for copyright reasons, but I would say boundaries in a relationship is very important. We've been together for a long time, and so at the beginning of our relationship, I don't think that we knew how to set boundaries. And even as a man, when I say boundaries, I don't look at boundaries from a woman's perspective. But I will say that I just handle it and I take care of business. I don't look at it as boundaries because either I'm going to do it or I'm not going to do it, and nobody's going to make me do it. But I know from a woman's perspective, you mentioned boundaries, and I guess when it comes to a man's perspective, we don't call it boundaries. We're just not going to do nothing that we don't want to do. And I'm not speaking for all men, but about 99% of the men that I hang out with, I can't say that we've had that conversation of setting boundaries. Raven, when you ask me to do something, it's like my wife asked me to do something. So I'm going to do it. And it's the same thing at work. When I'm at work and there's something that needs to be complete, I'm going to just do it.
I get what you're saying, but let me break it down this way. So, when we talk about boundaries, what we're talking about in this particular aspect is when you don't have self control over yourself and you allow a situation or a person to make you react or have a reaction based on what they said or what they did. Does that make sense?
It actually does. But a lot of people may not recognize that as a boundary, and at their core, it's really about self-respect and self-awareness. When you're setting boundaries, it's often less about telling someone else no, and more about telling yourself what you need in order to preserve your well-being. I think we've learned how to navigate this more organically by handling things without needing to label them explicitly as boundaries, which can sometimes feel like a buzzword or an overcomplicated concept in a lot of relationships.
Well, honey, speak for yourself because whether or not I say to you, Breeze, you're crossing over my boundary, there is a boundary in place for you. Just know that.
And I'm cool with it because it's worked for you. But let's play a small clip of this Tasha Smith's interview that she did with this young lady on YouTube.
Understood our value, we would have more boundaries and we wouldn't take so much. If you understood your value, you would probably be quicker to walk away from bull. Like for me at this point in my life, I'm not spinning the block on bull. And you have to have self-respect and you have to have boundaries.
Yes.
You just do.
Yes.
And you got to value yourself. If you don't value yourself, trust and believe a man won't value you.
That was so powerful what Tasha Smith said. I would say this: I didn't have boundaries in my 20s, and I did not develop boundaries until almost my late 30s. And let's just break that down, because when I say that I didn't have boundaries, I'm saying that I didn't have boundaries in friendships. I did not have boundaries when it came to my siblings. I did not have boundaries when it came to this marriage. So those are like the most important people in my life that I need to have boundaries with. And I will say when it comes to my mama, I ended up establishing boundaries. And I didn't even know that I was establishing a boundary, because when I think about it, before I hit the age of 20, and this was by accident when this happened between me and my mom, she forced me to have a boundary with her based on how our relationship was at that time. And I realized that setting boundaries is not for the other person, it's really for you. It really boils down to you, because when people trigger you in a certain way because you have boundaries within yourself, it's not going to allow you to overstep that boundary. Like, you're not going to overstep the line in the middle of the sand to get on the level that they're on. And just to further break that down, I'm really talking about emotional boundaries, because people are so emotional these days. People are so quick to pop off. They're quick to respond. They're so quick to react in a way that really we should caution ourselves before we act or respond to what the other person is doing. And when it comes to having boundaries, like in a relationship, it's great to establish those boundaries because you don't want to be codependent on the other person.
You touched on something important when you said boundaries are more for you than for the other person. That's the key shift. Boundaries are ultimately about self-care and self-respect. It's about knowing what you need emotionally and mentally and being able to say, this is where I draw the line. So you don't end up overextending yourself or allowing other people's issues to drain you. Now that you've developed these boundaries more consciously, do you feel like it's easier to navigate tricky situations with people, or do you still find yourself sometimes slipping into old patterns?
I do tend to backslide a little bit, but I don't think my backsliding is as much as it used to be, because when I go around certain people now, it's almost like I got to pray before I go around certain people, because there's been something going on in the last couple of months, and I mean, about what's been heavy around us that has recently happened. But again, I learned this technique back in 2022 when I went to therapy, and I had never really thought about life that way, like just having boundaries, that in order to do better, that I needed to establish emotional boundaries within my life. And it has trickled down from like friendships to actually establishing boundaries in this marriage. And when the therapist taught me that, it changed my life completely. I couldn't believe that this was the first time I was hearing something like that. Like, you hear it on social media, but I was such in a dire time in my life that what she said spoke like somebody screaming across the room at me, and it stuck like glue. It changed how I processed my day-to-day activities. It changed how much I would put on my plate for the day, trying to eat all of those different tasks off of my plate. It changed the way how I would wake up in the morning. And every day now is a good day to wake up, because I've learned to give God the glory first. Like, I've learned to thank Him first in the morning instead of worshiping my problems first thing in the morning, based on what I didn't get accomplished on yesterday or what somebody said to me. And so I'm confident also that whatever I didn't have an opportunity to do yesterday, that God is going to give me another opportunity to do it today. Even if I don't get it done today, it's going to be okay. Even if I don't get that thing done today, it's still going to be okay. And I'm going to tell you another thing. When that therapist told me that I needed to have boundaries in my everyday lives, I had to learn to enjoy people than what I have before. Like, when I would go out and socialize with my friends or hang around, family, I really thought that I was enjoying them at the time. But now, looking at this through this new way, I'm learning to enjoy people to the point where I will not allow for the conversation to go left no matter what. That is an emotional boundary. Like, even when I'm talking to you, Breeze, and we are having like a disagreement about something, I have learned to say, okay, we're not going to get anything accomplished in this moment. So let me just put a pin in this and I'll move on later. And when I put a pin in it, you got to believe that I'm meditating on it to even see if I can get past it in the moment and not just stay there because I want to get over it. And I understand that, we have to compromise in a marriage, but those are things that I have learned by establishing healthy emotional boundaries. Because you know how you can get caught up in a conversation, right? You're kicking, and then all of a sudden the conversation can go left because you may have stepped on somebody's toes or rubbed them the wrong way or said something out of line to the point where it hurt their feelings. So I am learning, and I have learned in the past, to just not cross over those boundaries with other people and really try to accept people for who they are. But do I backslide? Absolutely. I do tend to backslide from time to time.
It's also normal, as you mentioned, to backslide a bit from time to time, especially when you're navigating tough situations or people who may not be as emotionally aware or responsible as you. And then what you said about worshiping your problems versus giving God glory in the morning is so profound. That really struck me because it's easy to wake up with a sense of defeat or anxiety about what didn't get done. But shifting that focus to gratitude and trust that there's grace for tomorrow can completely change the energy you bring to the day. It's that mindset shift that keeps you grounded, even when things don't go as planned. What would you say has been the hardest part of maintaining these emotional boundaries for you? Is it with certain people or situations, or more about internal pressures you put on yourself?
Well, what it means is not having conversations with people that would make our conversation go in the opposite direction. You have to realize that people have to have accountability for themselves. I used to be so afraid to tell people no, and I would find myself in those conversations where I would sign up for something or I would try to be the shero, and I necessarily did not want to help them with that particular thing, but I just did it anyway because I felt like I had to step in, or I felt like they were trying to put so much pressure on me where it was just like, fine, I'll go ahead and do it anyway. But I have learned that you can sit there, you can listen to people, and they can vent all day. They can gripe about their day. They can gripe about the things that are going on in their lives. But you have to know the position that you hold, how valuable you are in other people's lives. So I have learned that I am the encourager. But, sometimes you can encourage people until you are blue in the face. Like, no matter which angle that you come from and no matter how much encouraging you're doing, they're just not picking up the golden nuggets that you're dropping. And so I have learned to just sit there sometimes and take as much as I can in. And then when I can't take anymore, I move on from the conversation, or I be like, girl, I'm going to pray for you. And then I tell them it's going to be okay. And I genuinely mean that, that I'm going to go pray for you. I tell them I got to go because that's part of having healthy emotional boundaries within your friends. Some of us want to take on so much from these friendships. We want to be our friend's best friend. We want to be their rescuer. We want to be the friend to give advice. But sometimes you need to know your place and understand what your place is in people's lives, and that you are not called to that person to be their pastor, to be their best friend, to be the one that talks them off the ledge. Yes, you can help in some situations, but when it becomes toxic, and I think for me, what I have learned in this year, that I was sometimes that everything to somebody and it had become toxic. Now I don't want to be their friend that everybody calls on. I need to know my place in your life so that I'll know how to treat you accordingly.
The part about being afraid to say no really resonates. Many of us can relate to feeling like we have to say yes or overextend ourselves, especially in friendships or close relationships. We don't want to disappoint or be seen as selfish. When you're constantly agreeing to things you don't really want to do or stepping into situations that drain you, it can cause burnout and resentment. even if you're trying to be supportive. And it's such a fine line between being a good friend and taking on too much of someone else's emotional baggage. That's hard, but it's also so necessary for your own well-being. Sometimes we think that if we're not solving their problems or being their sounding board constantly, we're not being a good friend. But really, knowing your boundaries means accepting that you don't have to be everything to everyone. You don't have to take on their emotional burdens to prove you care. You can still show up with love and compassion without overgiving or overcommitting. This is something that I think a lot of people struggle with in friendships because we often see ourselves as the helper or the strong one. But in order to be the best friend, partner, or family member, you have to first be good to yourself. When you're running on empty, you don't have the capacity to show up in a healthy way for others.
Well, love, this has been a great podcast, and we're going to go ahead and end the podcast here. But do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, good job on doing the work and being vulnerable in this moment. I don't know how you did because, girl, you are private, but high five to all of that. And we want to answer your questions in regards to emotional boundaries. We're not a therapist. We don't claim to be a therapist. But maybe we can answer your question based on experience or just from our perspective. People don't have someone they can talk to. And so we would love to hear from you. You can send your questions to our email address, which will be in the description box. And my prayer is that we broke down the topic of emotional boundaries to the point where it's clear, and I even learned something because I don't look at with what I go through and say I'm going to have emotional boundaries. But if I was to put it into a definition text, and there you have, it would be me setting an emotional boundary. So thank you for listening and see you in the next podcast.